This morning, as part of our special Christmas series, as we were kind of planning out how we wanted to do Christmas here at Crossroads this year, we started throwing around the idea of bringing in a guest speaker, and I was absolutely excited because Paul Young, who's the author of the book The Shack, I'd like to say he wrote his second book out, is called Crossroads, which obviously he named for us because he loves us so much. But we're really excited to have Paul here. He's a newer friend of mine, somebody who I've been getting to know, and I just so appreciate the gifts that God has given him, and not only the gifts, but the humility in which he uses those gifts to bless people, to try and reach people with the message of God's love that is so extravagant that he would give his own son. So when I was telling Paul about coming, I told him that Crossroads will be the most receptive, excited, energetic, and fun audience he's going to get to speak to all year. Amen? Amen? Amen. So give Paul Young a warm Crossroads welcome.
Thanks, Daniel. You bet. Morning. I dressed up for you this morning. It's my Christmas present. Part wool. I was going to see if I could tease some dreads out of it, but I just... You know under all that hair he's bald, right? Just... Okay. The coming of a son. Thank you for having me here. Some of you don't know, but Bill and Betty, or should I say Betty and Bill, are good friends. And the Shack sort of came through as a phenomenon, you know, and it touched people's hearts, and then their heads engaged, and it kind of went the other way for a while. Because it's one thing for you to hear something in your heart, but then your head, which has been taught a whole bunch of other stuff, kind of runs interference and says it can't be that good, or something like that. And in that process, there were some folks who kind of pushed back on the Shack and Crossroads, and just so you know, those are my people, the ones who push back. I grew up fundamental evangelical Protestant, right? So we don't even have to read something to be right about it. And in that process, Bill took a few bullets for me, just so you know. And I didn't bring any books to sell, because when you're going to be with family, you don't try to sell them stuff. Unless you're growing up the way I did, where we had Amway. But that's a whole different story. Tell you, Amway, you can destroy every relationship you've ever had. But it is the American way. It's about destroying relationships, right? So let's not go into my woundedness yet. All right. So there's great celebration being here. I love this time of year. I didn't always like this time of year. You know, coming up to the end of a year when I was growing up was like having to think about the fact that I'd failed for a year and that I probably was going to do it the next year too. And it wasn't exactly a fun time. A lot of us don't come out of situations where the house on the inside was built easily, or we got good help. And you have to deal with that stuff at some point. There are some really beautiful things that I want to talk to you about in terms of the coming of a son. There's been this theme throughout Scripture about the coming of a son. And if you remember the first coming of a son, which was highly anticipated, and I don't think we understand very well, was the birth of a boy in which the mother thought the entire cosmos would be reconciled back to God in this son. Now, if you don't read it, or you just heard the story about it, you don't really see it, but it's in Genesis. And Genesis is a story about how darkness and sin and death entered the world, and the New Testament is very clear, 8 times very clear, that it says that through one male, sin entered the world. And it uses the Greek word aner, which is the word for male, as opposed to anthropos, which is the word for human being. So it's very clear 8 times that sin enters the world through a male. That's important. It also, if you read the text in Genesis and not just think you know the story, there's also the sense in which the first created male, Adam, decided or had begun to step away from his relationship to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit before the woman was drawn out of him, that he was already spinning out of control. There's 3 evidences for that right off the bat that are easy to see, and there's more besides that. The first one was that he was given charge to take care of the garden, tend and, remember the other word? Keep. Keep and tend. Tend is a gardening word. Keep is a guardian word, right? That means to keep out or to protect or to something. The word shows up in the very beginning of the story when God says to Adam, this is prior to Isha, the woman, being removed from him. And he says to Adam, you know, you can do all of this, tend and keep this place. That tree don't eat of. On the day you eat of it, in dying you will die. Not if you eat of it, you will. And I'm just telling you, on the day you eat of it, and the Hebrew has got a double construction there, in dying you will die. Well, he didn't keep the garden. The next time that word keep shows up is when cherubim are placed at the gate of the garden to keep the way back to the tree of life. That's the word keep. And by the way, he, Adam, is the one removed from the garden. She is not, nor is she denied access to the tree of life. We have a lot of mythology about the way we see things. And the second thing is that it says that it's not good that Adam's alone. But see, we read that like in our Western sense of disconnected loneliness, and we're thinking, well, it's not good that a man be alone. Well, that's not the Hebrew. The Hebrew says it's not good that he is now in his separation, in his sense of separation. He's already begun to question the goodness of God. He's already begun to travel down a different road. And he's beginning to create a mythology about the character of God. The third thing that shows up is we get to overhear the conversation that happens after they've eaten of the tree, and then they went and hidden, and God plays the hide and seek game, although he knows where they are, right? Like, where are you? He knows. And they have a conversation. This is right after the first conversation about God you will ever see in Scripture. A conversation about God. And what is that conversation? You can't trust him. And whose mouth is that conversation emanating from? The serpent, the accuser. And if you read it, it is a direct attack against God's character. The serpent's got a finger waving. Well, I don't know if he had fingers, but he's got a forked tongue waving in the face of God or whatever. And it is an attack against God's character. After they eat, after they've expressed their rebellion, and Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have this conversation with the three, the male, the female, and the serpent. And the first question is directed to the male. What did you do? God knows what they did. This is, again, an invitation into relationship. What happened here? What happened? And the male says, the woman you gave me. The man enters an accusation against the character of God. Right? Now, isn't it interesting that in the conversation with the serpent, if you read it, it was a direct attack against her. And what did the man do during this direct attack? He did the man thing. Nothing. He didn't even say anything. And when the serpent made an accusation against the character of God and then an attack against her, she quotes something that she believes is actually true, that she could only have heard from the man. Does he correct her? No. He lets the attack take place. And then, in the conversation with God, the man walks around the table, joins the serpent in an accusation that sounds almost identical to the attack against the goodness of God. And when God turns to the woman and says, "You tell me what happened," she says, "He," and you don't know whether she's pointing at the serpent or at Adam. "He deceived me, and I ate." And God looks at those two, the serpent and Adam, and says, "Look, Adam, your salvation will come through this woman and your destruction. You have to leave because you're in a rebellious state. She is the first believer. She. Sin had entered through the male. She follows him out, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens as a result. Adam and now Eve, and it says that she is named, he calls her Eve because, he doesn't actually name her, but he calls her Eve because she is the mother of the living. What does he know about himself at this point? He's dead. On the day you eat of it, in dying you will die. She's the mother of the living. They have a son. And when the son is born, the cry of this woman, Eve, is, and in the Hebrew it's very distinct. If you have New American Standard, it'll show you in italics and things like that. "I have begotten a man-child, the Lord." Not with the help of. That's in italics, which means it's not in the original language. "I have begotten a man-child, the Lord." She thought Cain was going to be the deliverer. She thought Cain was going to be the coming son. And she must have watched his life because by the time Abel is born, she names him the Hebrew word for sighing, or hope is fading away. And her first son kills her second son, like the first Adam will ultimately kill the second. The coming of a son. So let's back this off a bit. You know, there was a time before there was Crossroads Church, right? Right? You know, there was a time before this building existed. There was a time before this state existed. Actually, there was a time before there was any time, space, or matter, right? Before creation. There was a before, to use time-bound language, right? There was a time where there was no space, time, or matter, right? What was there? Because, this is important, because whatever was there created all of this. Right? So, what was there? John's gospel begins with this. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was turned toward God. And if you didn't get it right, he repeats it in verse 2. And then he makes a stunning declaration. Everything that has come into being has come into being in him. Not anything that has come into being has come into being apart from the Word. So, when all that exists is a relationship between the Father and the Son, and then we're going to be introduced in John 1 to the Holy Spirit, who is also in the middle of this, 3 persons. This is why there is such a thing as love and relationship, because there's always been love and relationship as the very nature of God. This God by nature loves, right? So you have Father, Son, the Word. You have the Word, you have the Father, you have breath, wind, Spirit, and you have this relationship. Creation isn't created out from that relationship. It is created in Him. In Him. In the Word. This is New Testament theology. You can find it in Colossians. You can find it in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. You can find it in Philippians. You can find it in 1 John. This is the gospel. That creation, and I'm not talking about creation in a general sense. I'm talking about every subatomic particle, every human being who would ever come into being is in Christ, in the Word. And that Word becomes flesh. Where does He go to become flesh? Into Himself. You understand? Because everything that moves, has its being, everything that is in Him. See, when I was growing up, God the Father was sort of Gandalf with an attitude anyway, and not a good attitude, right? So our imagination was that God is over here and He spins creation off out there somewhere, and it messes itself up, so He sends Jesus to become the bridge back. The New Testament is everything is created in Him, for Him, by Him, through Him. When this little baby shows up without the will of a male, is what it says. Born without the will or the flesh of a male. This little baby, in this little baby, every being moves and breathes and has its being. In Him, in this little baby. This is not just a 100% human being. Now, this is a 100% human being. This is not God playing baby. Like, oh, let's see, how old am I? I need to poop about right now. You know, it's not like pretend baby, right? This is fully human. The coming of a son. Okay. With that in mind, let's talk about the significance of just the one. And I'm going to tell you a story. A number of you have heard it. Now, by the way, I've got a whole bunch of about half of you, I think, are about my extended family, just so you know. So be careful. My wife Kim is here. My daughter Amy is here. Kim has 5 sisters, and I promised to do this. One of them is my favorite. They're all waving over there, right? So. I said, yeah, we had a family party last night. I said, yeah, I'll say that, tomorrow when I get up, I'll say one of you is my favorite. So I did. You're welcome. Kim and her 5 sisters are called the Force. May the Force be with you. So I grew up religious. They grew up Minnesota, North Dakota. So they're actually authentic people. Genetically enhanced to all talk loudly at the same time and understand each other, right? I come from a religious background, so we lied about everything, hid most stuff, different worlds. Kim saved my life, just so you know. Missionary kids, preacher's kids, So I want to tell you a story because this story is about the coming of a son, and it's a beautiful story. And we will wrap up some of the sense of what I've presented in terms of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Because when you're dealing with that little baby, you're dealing with someone who matters. And my point of this, I think, by the end of our time together, is that everyone matters. The fact that God chose from before the foundation of the world to become a child and fully join our humanity, would that tell you that God has a low view of humanity? He didn't become an angel. He didn't become anything else. God has fully joined his very character and nature to our humanity in Jesus. Jesus is at the center of everything. Whatever happens to Jesus is going to happen to us all. If you don't believe that, read 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Just kind of spend a little time there, because that's what that chapter is all about. Now, if you've read The Shack, you know that I kind of used imagery that isn't usual. Now, it helps to know that I only made 15 copies at Office Depot and went back to work. I never, ever intended that that book would, be published, let alone become the phenomenon that it has. The first 15 copies did everything I ever wanted that book to do. And everything that matters to me was in place before I wrote it. So the book has added nothing in any essential sense to me. Now, when the book, through a whole series of wild, crazy things, God, sense of humor stuff, happens to become this phenomenon, there were people that had a problem with it. Well, a bunch of them. Not a bunch of people. Well, there were a bunch of people, but a bunch of problems. And one of them was the imagery that I used for God, right? Particularly God the Father. Now, people they'll come up with reasons that they don't like anything, right? So, my people are famous, again, most of the people that are mad about The Shack didn't read it. My people. And now we come from a tradition where being right is more important than loving, because loving's way harder, right? So being right's way easier. And so the book, these 15 copies, begin to become this phenomenon. And God the Father, if you haven't read The Shack, and Crossroads plays with imagery as well, but God the Father in The Shack is a large black African-American woman, named Papa. Because I'm mixing metaphors, right? Because I grew up, I told you, with the white, grandfatherly, distant, unapproachable, unreachable, unknowable, unemotional, God, sitting in the infinite distance of a disapproving heart, and Jesus comes to save me from him. Because he's the one that's all ticked off and stuff, right? It's my theological background. So I write a story, and in it, God the Father is a large black African-American woman. Well, that surprised people. I had written it for 6 kids and friends and family. And now it becomes this international phenomenon, and my mom read it. Well, she tried to read it. She got to the chapter where Papa came through the door, and she closed the book. She tried. Her son wrote a book. And she called my sister, Debbie, and she said, "Debbie, your brother is a heretic." It's my mom, right? So one of my favorite stories ever, and will probably be the rest of my life, is this story, because I actually believe now, and it only took 50 years, but I actually believe that God is good all the time, and that this God is involved in the details of our lives, right? Well, I love when I see circles come full circle. You get bits and pieces sometimes, but sometimes you get to actually see something, because God continues to be involved in circles of relationships, just circles. And here's one of them. In 1946, which is a few years ago, my mother was 18 years old. She was a single woman. She entered nurses training in Victoria, Jubilee Hospital up in Victoria, British Columbia. Have you been to Victoria? Anybody? My uncle built the wax museum. right? And but my mom and one of her sisters, Ruby, entered nurses training at Jubilee, and it was a 3-year nurses program. And this is 1946. God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and doctors. And it was kind of a holy profession. It was all men, right? And you never disagreed or countermanded a doctor. You just didn't do it. And my mom had been in nurses training for 3 months when a woman comes into the hospital and she's bleeding, and come to find out that it's Reverend Munn's wife. And Reverend Munn was the senior pastor of the Anglican Church in Victoria, and Reverend and Mrs. Munn had been trying to have a son, a child, a daughter, just a child. They had experienced, according to their charts, 5 late second trimester, early third trimester miscarriages in a row. Now, 1946, there's no NICU, there's no neonatal. At best, there's little chicken incubator kind of things. I don't know if you remember those. I remember them when I was a kid. My mom was an RN. Kim's and the Force's mom was an RN. And so she comes into the hospital bleeding, and she is 6.5 months pregnant for the 6th time. They call the head of OB. He rushes in. He examines her, and he says, the mother's life's in danger. We're going to have to take the baby. So he sets up an emergency C-section. He grabs the head nurse to assist. He grabs a student nurse to assist to learn and to do the cleanup. Guess who? My mom. She had been 3 months in nurses training. She had just gotten her cap, which meant, she says, that she looked cooler, but didn't know anything, right? She's 18 years old, German Baptist girl, and she is pulled into an emergency C-section in which the doctor delivers a 1-pound baby boy, 16 ounces. That means the entire body of this baby is the size of a stick of butter, right? Another visual, our third grandchild is Houston Parker, born emergency, C-section, premature, 4 pounds and 1/2 ounce, and I have a picture of his entire fist like this, with lots of room to spare inside my son's wedding band. Okay? This is a 1-pound baby, and in 1946, 1-pound babies, especially boys, because boys struggle harder to stay alive as prematures than girls do. Girls are stronger, right? But this 1-pound baby boy was not anticipated to live. So the doctor puts him in a kidney tray, hands him to my mother, and says these words, "It's not viable, dispose of it." Which meant the incinerator. That's how you dealt with medical waste, is you put it in the incinerator. He goes back to finish the operation. My mother's looking at this little baby boy, and he's still breathing, and she doesn't know what to do. So she walks out into the service area outside the operating room trying to figure out what to do, and she comes up with a plan. So she finds a washcloth, wraps this little baby boy up in the washcloth, puts him back in the kidney tray, walks back into the operating room, and puts him up on top of the sterilization unit because it's the only warm place in the room. And if you've been around preemies, you know that most of them don't say anything. They don't cry, they're silent. So she puts the baby up on top of the sterilization unit. What's her plan? Wait till the baby dies, because she couldn't put a breathing baby in the incinerator. So she's going to wait till the baby dies, and then she can obey the doctor, and that's it. The doctor finishes his part of the operation, and he leaves. He's done. Mrs. Munn is taken to post-op by the head nurse, and that left my mother to do the cleanup in the operating room, is what she did. Baby was born 8:30 p.m., May the 30th, 1946. My mother does the cleanup in the operating room, and then she sits in a chair in the operating room holding this little baby boy, waiting for him to die. 9:30 approximately, the doctor meets with the family, Mr. and Mrs. Munn, Reverend and Mrs. Munn, and he gives them the bad news. I'm sorry, you had a son. He wasn't viable, and he did not survive. Reverend and Mrs. Munn are now grieving the loss of their 6th child. Doctor goes home. My mother's sitting, unbeknownst to anybody, in the operating room holding this little baby boy waiting for him to die. 10:30 at night, 11:30 at night, 12:30. At 1:30 in the morning, my mother says to herself, well, I should probably tell somebody about this. So she calls the head nurse who assisted and tells her what she did. And the head nurse's response is, we are in so much trouble. But the head nurse has to call the doctor. The doctor comes rushing in from home, and he is furious. And he rips into this 18-year-old single nurse's wannabe and just tears her apart. Because of her insubordination, she has now placed him and the hospital in a situation. So he basically says, you created this problem, you're now responsible for it, but don't you dare say anything to the parents. So there is a code of silence on this. My mother takes this little tiny baby boy up to the nursery. They begin feeding him with an eyedropper, and over the next 2 days, as often happens, he lost weight, down to 12 ounces. He lost a quarter of his body weight in the first 2 days. Nobody has said anything to the parents. What's the doctor thinking? He's thinking the baby's going to die. And as soon as the baby dies, code of silence. Nobody has to know. It's all taken care of, right? The baby starts to pick up weight. And the doctor realizes he's stuck, and he needs to say something to the parents before this gets any further down the road. So the parents have been grieving for almost 3 days. And he goes to the parents and he says, I am so sorry I spoke too soon. We didn't want to give you any false hope at the time. But due to the miracles of modern medicine, we have managed to sustain, but we think he won't survive. And even if he did, he's going to have brain damage, he's going to have MS, they are thrilled. They have a son. They name him Harold. Good news, right? Hark, the herald. Angels sing. Good news. And my mother and the nurses care for Harold round the clock. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Munn went home. 2 months later, little tiny Harold went home to his parents. And 2 years later, my mother, because they knew that she was part of the staff that took care of Harold, she gets an invitation to his 2nd birthday party. Meanwhile, the parents have been asking the doctor in the hospital, what really happened here? You know, there's this mystery and this gap and stuff. What's this all about? And there's this code of silence. Nobody will answer their questions. My mother gets the invite because she's part of who took care of Harold. They have no idea what she actually did. So she goes because she's curious. She hasn't heard how Harold's doing. And she says, I'm sitting there, I'm watching all these little kids playing around, trying to figure out, where's Harold? And I realize one of those little boys that's running around, a little skinnier than the other ones, but that's Harold, and he looks perfectly normal. My mother still says nothing. She graduates that year, moves to central Canada, to Saskatchewan, goes to Bible school, meets my dad. My dad had just come straight out of the logging camp, so he was well equipped to be a father. And orphaned when he was 12, you know. And he'd had a massive conversion in the logging camps, came straight to Bible school, met my mom, they got married, and they spent a year in Canada. I was born, and when I was 10 months old, the three of us packed up everything we had, and we moved to the highlands of New Guinea, where I grew up, thinking I was black. Until boarding school at 6. And we came back to Canada before I was 10 years old. We traveled around a lot. My father was an itinerant pastor, so I went to 13 schools before I graduated high school. And I graduated high school in northern British Columbia in a little town called Terrace, which is just below the panhandle of Alaska, 90 miles inland from Prince Rupert. I'm 17 years old. My mother's working at the hospital, and one day she reads an obituary in an Anglican newsletter. And it's for the death of Bishop Munn. And she's a little curious, so she asked the nurse who happened to be working with her, who happened to be Anglican, "Did you know Bishop Munn?" And this nurse said, "Yes, actually, very well." "Really?" And my mom's still not sure, so she says, "Well, did he ever have any children?" And this gal says, "Yes, one son." "Do you know where that son is?" This gal says, "Nope, I sort of lost track of him. Fairly remarkable child, graduated college when he was 15, and he ended up being a teacher missionary in West Africa, last I remember." My mother still says nothing. Not for 10 more years. Old school. 10 years later, I'm 27. I'm down here in Portland. Kim and I are married. We have a couple children. My mother reads another obituary. You know, I guess you get to the place where you start looking to make sure you're not in them or something, you know? Guess who died this time? The doctor. The one that got mad at her? The doctor died. I'm 27 years old, the first time I ever hear this story. My mother had kept it to herself all these years because you don't make a doctor look bad, or old school. I'm 27 years old, find out about Harold Munn. Well, now that the doctor was dead and he ain't coming back, my mom figured out, I want to find Harold and tell him the truth about his birth. And she found him. He was now the senior pastor of the Anglican Church just down the road from where his father pastored in 1946. And my mother stews for 6 months trying to figure out, how do I tell Harold the truth about his birth without him thinking that I'm just looking for credit? And she finally figures out how to do it. And you know what she did? She waited till Christmas. And she wrapped up his story inside the story of the coming of a son. Good news. She sends it to him. He immediately contacts her and says, "We need to talk." My mom gets together, my mom and dad, with Harold and his wife, and my mom tells Harold the real story, and he is blown away. He said, "We always knew there was a mystery about the way that I was born. Nobody could tell us." As you can imagine, Harold and my mom had become very close. One day, my mom says to Harold, "Harold, I have this son, and he wrote this book. And I'm having a problem with it." And Harold Munn says, "Well, Bernice, why don't you let me read it and I'll tell you what I think." "Oh, would you do that?" Harold Munn reads the shack, sends me an email. "Paul, I read your book. I love everything there is about your book, but I think your mom is struggling with the imagery that you use for God the Father. Let me see if I can do something about that." And Harold Munn blind copies me on an email to my mother. "Dear Bernice, I read Paul's book. You need to know that I love this book. But you're probably struggling with Papa, the imagery that Paul uses for God the Father. Let me tell you why that imagery is so important to me." And Harold lays it out. God is not male or female. All of maleness, all of femaleness is derived from the nature and character of God. God is maternal and paternal. When you're introduced to the Holy Spirit in verse 2 of Genesis, ruach, it's feminine, and the verbs are feminine. The word womb and the word mercy come from the same root. Imagery was not intended to define God. It was to help us understand elements and facets of the character of God. So God is a woman who loses a coin, or a father who's lost a son, or God is a nursing mother in Isaiah, or in the Psalms, he's a rock. You know he's not a rock, right? But when someone says God is a rock or a fortress or a strong tower or a shield, you know what that means here, right? My mom saved a 1-pound baby boy in 1946. That baby boy grew up to be the man who built the bridge so that my mother could walk across it for her own son. How beautiful is that? My mom now loves the shack. What? Hey, she doesn't understand it, but Harold loves it. Last little piece of story and we're done. I told you my mom went into nurses training with Ruby, her sister. Now Ruby, on my mom's family, Ruby is the wild child, right, of this German Baptist family. 8 kids, and Ruby is the wild child. She is the free spirit, yeah? She's the cosmic vacuum cleaner that'll suck up anything, right? She is the one that nobody has really had any control over, right? And she breaks the rules. She's my favorite aunt. And she took me to my first movie, which was totally a violation. And you know, if I had to shuffle so that if I had one foot up when Jesus came, I'd go straight to hell otherwise, you know. And so it was The King and I with Yul Brynner. Yeah. You saw his bald head too? Yeah. So anyway, Ruby went to nurses training with my mom. And my mom's been trying to lead Ruby back to Jesus for 50 years, right? So one night she's talking to Ruby, and they're in Victoria. That's where Ruby lives. And Ruby says, "Hey, Bernice, why don't we go to church tomorrow?" And my mom says, You want to go to church?" She says, "Yeah." Where do you want to go?" Ruby says, "I don't know." "Hey, let's go hear Harold." See, neither my mom or Ruby had been in Harold's Anglican church. Now, this is not just a low Anglican church. This is like a moderately high Anglican church. It's one of those places that you can immediately spot people who have no idea what they're doing. Okay? And so my mom and Ruby slip into the back row, and immediately this woman realizes these two don't know what they're doing, so she slides in to help them. When to stand, when to kneel, when to whatever. So during the homily, now this is an Anglican church, so it's like this row, but twice as long back there, right? And Harold is doing the sermon, the homily, and halfway through his homily, he spots my mother sitting in the back row, and he stops. And he says, "Folks, I need to tell you a story. There is a woman here who, if it wasn't for her, I would not be alive. And in fact, every person I have ever touched in my life, she has touched through me." And he tells his people the story and introduces my mom. At the end, he goes back, finishes his sermon, and at the end of which everyone goes to the front for communion. And the woman sitting next to my mother mistakenly says to her, "I'm so sorry, dear, but in our tradition here, you have to be a member to participate in communion." It's good she wasn't sitting next to Ruby. My mother says, don't worry about it. I understand different faith traditions. It's totally okay. I'm not offended, which is the truth. Harold finishes the serving of the communion. Then he walks over, and he's got robes on, right? Because it's moderately high Anglican. And he takes the outer robes off until he's just wearing his white smock. And then he walks over, and he picks up the bread, and he picks up the cup. And he walks down the front steps, and he walks all the way to the back and kneels in front of my mother and in front of Ruby. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. And it didn't matter whether you were agnostic or atheist or Baptist or Episcopal or Catholic or Muslim or Buddhist. You know what matters? A broken body and shed blood. This is a God from before the foundation of the world made the choice to come and meet us in our deepest, darkest loss. God did not originate the cross. We did. God fully anticipated the cross, knowing this is how lost. This will become the iconic symbol of their devastation, a device that only exists to torture. And Jesus is slain from the foundation and comes as a little baby so that he could grow up in our world, and then he could crawl on that torture device and transform it into an icon and a monument of kindness and grace and forgiveness that is so precious to us, we would take images and wear them around our neck or on our rings. Relentless love. There is no plan B. The baby is plan A, the coming of the Son. Amen.